All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Tracy Edwards, for those of you who don't know me, and I'm the director of PPS for Weston. I'm joined by a few of my colleagues tonight. We have Dan Doak, the middle school principal, Julie Giavoni, high school principal, and Meredith Starzik, one of our wonderful school counselors at the high school. And we're also very fortunate to have Dr. Kaplan, who is our presenter this evening. Dr. Kaplan is an MD psychiatrist. He's affiliated with the Yale Child Study Center. He has his own private practice in New Haven. And in addition to all of that work, he works closely with public and private schools throughout Connecticut, including Weston. I think we can all acknowledge how challenging the last 2 years have been. So the purpose of tonight's session is to focus really on our middle school and high school students and how you as families can support your teenagers at home during these very complex times. As I said, we're recording tonight's presentation. We will turn the recording off at the end of Dr. Kaplan's presentation, and we'll have a question and answer session at that point. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Kaplan.
All right, thank you so much, Tracy. And it's really a pleasure for me to be here with you, zooming in from my office in New Haven. And I was saying before we got on, I really miss, as we all do, human contact. And 2 years is too long to not have human contact. And I would love to be in a room with all of you. That would make it a lot more meaningful and interactive and special. And you could get a sense of me and I could get a sense of you. The only people I see are Tracy, Dan, and a little bit of Meredith. So you guys have to do a lot of reacting to my jokes and things because it's all on you guys for me to feel like someone's paying attention. But that actually is a segue into what we'll be talking about, which is sort of what we've lost in the last 2 years, and how we think about that. Clearly we know how it has affected us, but we also want to think more importantly today about how it has affected our children. It's difficult to separate those two things out because it's affected all of us. We'll get into it. There are a few things I want to say before we get started. First, I've just started working with the district this year, and I just want to let you as parents know how impressed I am with the staff that I've been working with and meeting with and talking with and consulting with, and they are working very hard on behalf of your children. And I've been fond of telling my colleagues and friends about how excited I am about this collaboration that we've started this year, and that hopefully will continue to grow, and you'll hear more about it. But this is one of the things that Tracy and I and Julie and Dan had talked about at the beginning of the year, which was to also use me not just for the teachers and staff, but also to have me be a resource for the district and the families. And so this is really our first, those of you who are here, this is our inaugural effort of bringing some of what I have to offer to you as well, and that I can be a person that you have a sense of. So I'm very excited to be here tonight, and I hope this is the first of many other conversations. We could never run out of topics when it comes to children. They're endlessly interesting, fascinating, frustrating, joy creating, and having the last word on children we never will have. So I know there'll be more to come. The other thing I like to say before yes.
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second? So we have families saying that they're hearing some feedback on your end. Is there any way that you could be closer to your microphone?
Okay, thank you.
Maybe.
I have nothing else on, so I'll do my best.
I think it actually might be picking up your arm motions, if that makes sense. It seems, I mean, obviously I talk with my hands too, but that might be what's happening.
Okay, just feel free to interrupt. I have my fingers interlocked under my desk. Okay, so what I was saying, so often when I give a kind of talk like this, when I talk about adolescence and parenting, there can be a sense that, oh, this Kaplan guy is an expert and he's going to tell us all these things, and I'm going to leave feeling like a terrible parent, or I'm doing it all wrong. The risk of reading parenting magazines, I find, is that they seem to have these cheery people in their pictures and sidebars with things to do, and it seems impossible, to get dinner on the table with a healthy meal and all your children happy and they've got their homework completed and their teeth brushed and in their pajamas at a reasonable time. And so what I want to say to everyone here is that parenting is a hard job, and COVID made it only harder. And my feeling is that if you're getting a B or a B plus in parenting, that's a really good grade. We're all, existing in this community that is very high performing, and we bring that high performing nature to our work as parents. And I want to say that you guys deserve a break, and that this is that I don't want anyone to leave this evening feeling like they're doing it all wrong. In fact, by being here, it gives me a lot of encouragement that you are all interested in this and how to do a better job. So the way I like to give presentations is to start by talking about kind of what's the background, what's underneath all of this. Particularly if we're going to talk about teenagers, we need to have a shared language about normal development, what's going on in brain development, what can we expect of adolescents, before we move on to how COVID has had an impact. I'll take us on a quick tour through those topics because I want to make sure we have enough room at the end, time at the end to have conversations, that we can make this a very interactive evening. And so then, because you are here to hear some kind of sidebar in a parenting magazine things from me, I do have the sidebar at the end, like the 10 things you need to know, the 3 things you should do, kinds of things. So I promise I will leave you with something tangible to move on to. So now we'll move on to the slides. So this has been a tough time. It's been a tough time for everybody. And we were saying, can we believe that it's been 2 years, that this March will be 2 years? Where were we all 2 years ago? We were hearing about like some cruise ship off the coast of San Francisco that wasn't coming back because it had so many COVID cases. I think there was a Navy ship that had COVID. I'm pulling back. That seems like a lifetime ago. And we've been living through this for a long time together with our children. And I think we also need to appreciate how long and what a struggle that's been for everybody. And that's been, really hard to go on that long. I like to call, for many of us, I think we've lost track of time, as one impact of COVID. Like, when did this all start? What summer was that? What grade was this kid in? What grade was that? When did we're all doing that. It's hard for me. Oh yeah, March 2020, that's when it started. Or was it March 2019? Or we're all, I like to refer to days have lost their meaning and they're all called Blur's Day now. So everything is not Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, it's all Blur's Day. The other thing I want to mention is that it can be sometimes, I'll get to that in a second. We're talking about a broad range of ages here. We have middle school to high school as our focus. And I know that often issues for 6th and 7th graders are very different from 11th and 12th graders. So I'm going to try and be as broad as possible and leave the question and answer period for our addressing, say, individual ages. So what about stress? We often talk about stress as bad and something we want to avoid or something we're feeling a lot of. We will talk about that because not all stress is good stress, but not all stress is bad stress. The only way that we can grow and develop and learn is to experience some degree of stress. And that's how we challenge our system, whether it's by learning, long division or calculus or about the imperial period or biology or the Krebs cycle, or how we talk to kids, our friends, how we try out for the baseball team or audition for the school play. All of that is stressful, but not all of it is bad. Stress is necessary for development. It's necessary for progress. However, we do know that stress is on the rise, and that there are increasing rates of anxiety. Anytime you open the newspaper and read about children's mental health, we do know that there's a crisis right now in children's mental health in our country. But prior to the pandemic, we were already seeing signs of this. So we can't blame COVID for everything. There were increasing rates of anxiety, increasing rates of depression, and increasing rates of all of these things that are on this slide. I call this my doom and gloom slide. I'm an optimistic person, as you will probably learn quickly. So, but I have to share some of these things. So we do know that kids are suffering, and I don't want to minimize that at all. These are all statistics that predate COVID, and some of them include COVID. And we do know that the number of visits to emergency rooms, pediatric emergency rooms with children expressing suicidal thoughts or behaviors has gone way up. Those rates have gone up in an alarming fashion over the last 2 years. So what's going on inside the brain? And what's going on for adolescents? And I think it's important for us to think about what actually is happening to teenagers, because if we know what's happening to teenagers, then we can know how to talk to them or how to listen to them or how to educate them. And what we know is their brain is in active flux, that there are different parts of the brain that are developing at different rates. So we have the frontal part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, in children and adolescents is not fully developed. That's the part of the brain that deals with judgment, and planning, and execution. It's like the chief executive operator, the CEO of the brain. We have a deep part of the brain that I'll show you. Here's what's going on inside the brain. This is my funny slide. So if you really wanted to investigate what's going inside a teenager's brain, here it is. This comes out of the New England Journal of Medicine. It's a very famous study that I thought I'd share with you this evening. So I'll let you look at that, and I can't see. So Tracy's laughing good, Dan's laughing good. Thank you. Right on cue. So we have these deep structures in the brain called the amygdala, which controls fear and emotion and impulsivity. So we have the control center and the impulse center. In the old Freudian way of thinking about it, Freud would have said that was the ego in the front and the id in the deep in the brain. And those two parts of the brain are not talking very consistently or effectively or efficiently with each other. And over the course of adolescence, the frontal lobes of the brain start to take over, and the deeper parts of the brain start to quiet down. The way I like to think about adolescence is it's a fast car with very slow brakes. So their judgment is poor, impulsivity is high, they're highly reactive, they can be highly irritable, and that's kind of where we can get into trouble with teenagers, and where teenagers can get into trouble. Another lecture on teenage brain development I can go into more deeply, but we're just covering it very superficially today. So what we do know is that the brain of a teenager is not fully cooked. It's still growing, that the way in which the brain develops is that there's an over-proliferation of connections between neurons. And that over time, those connections start to prune away based on experience. So as the teenager has more experience and these pathways are laid down, the gray matter prunes, the redundancy disappears, and they can think more effectively and efficiently. They can get from point A to point B. The way I like to describe this difference between little kids and big kids or adults, there's this gorilla study, as I refer to it, that helps illustrate this point. So a while ago, some researchers videotaped two research subjects, research volunteers, passing a ball back and forth, and it's videotaped. And the people who come in to volunteer for the experiment are given this instruction. Count the number of times the ball gets passed back and forth. Halfway through the video, a person in a gorilla costume walks through. Turns out that the little kids get totally focused on the gorilla and stop counting how many times the ball is passed. The grown-ups, many of them, 60%, don't even notice the person in the gorilla costume walking by. Why is that? Because their brain is so efficient, it goes from point A to point B very quickly and filters out extraneous things. The brain of a young child, a middle school child, and a teenager even is not filtering out everything that's not essential. And so their brains are not, working the way our brains are. White matter starts to develop, the front to back development happens, and we eventually get to the place, hopefully by the time they're 18 and heading off to college, that they can make these decisions for themselves. The goal of this development, both biologically and psychologically, as we know, is to become more independent and function on our own. That sometimes doesn't happen until 25 or 35 or who knows when. So what are we looking for in terms of adolescent brain development? We're looking for judgment, concentration, decision-making, and social interaction. Those are the skills that are coming online as our children go, the students go through high school. There's a broad spectrum of normal, and even within each child, sometimes one day they have good judgment, and the next day they have poor judgment. And so there's a lot of whiplash that I think you experience with your children, because one day they seem to be like a 25-year-old, and the next day they seem like they're actually functioning like a toddler. Again, here's another slide about the frontal cortex, which is making decisions and controlling their impulses, and the deep parts of the brain that are focused on learning and emotions. So that's why it's often difficult for them to learn in high school and to tolerate these kinds of things, all made worse by COVID. All made worse by COVID. All of these normal developmental pathways that we come to expect, that are typical and expectable, were all impacted by COVID, because what do they need inside? You know, what other substrate does all of this need? It needs human interaction, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So paging Charles Darwin, we have a new species. It's called the teenager. They're very complicated. They drive us nuts, and they deserve their own, I think, species. And it's really like a second coming of toddlerhood. So the other point I like to make when I think about adolescence is that it's just like the 2-year-old, where they have new skills to motor away from us, but they don't have the judgment to think about what they're doing. But that's how I like to think about teenagers. It's like the toddler who now can walk away from mom and dad, but can get to a socket, you know, and put their finger in it, you know, or they can get underneath the cabinet and drink the Drano. Fortunately, with 2-year-olds, we're still much bigger than them, and we can pick them up and put them in their crib, or we can put locks on the cabinets, we can put plugs inside the sockets. I wish we had that for teenagers, because all of a sudden they have these new skills, abilities, and they can do many more things, and they can get further. They have a thing called a car and a driver's license, which some people think they shouldn't get till they're 25. But they don't have the skills and judgment. So that's why we know that teenagers often make mistakes, have accidents, and hopefully learn from them. So on to stress, and thinking about, so what's it been like, and how do we think about stress in teenagers? The way I like to think about stress is a fight or flight reaction, that it's natural, it's inborn, it's designed by evolution to keep us alive. That stress, again, not all stress is bad, and that we need stress to survive and to move forward. But when stress gets really bad, we go into what's called a fight or flight reaction. It's rapid, there's a release of adrenaline, and there's a release of stress hormones in the brain. That allows us to fight off dangerous, people or animals, and it also allows us to flee. It gets our body activated to go into fight or flight mode. That's very good if we're being attacked, we're being mugged, or someone's chasing after us, or we're in the jungle and some wild beast is coming after us. But it's not so good if it becomes chronic. It's not so good when these things become regular occurrences every day. And that's where COVID comes in. And that's where the impact, in my mind, comes in, and the effect it's had on our teenagers and on their brain development. What are the impacts of chronic stress, and how does it impact the brain? I'm going to spend just a second on this because I don't want to overwhelm you with biology. And there won't be a quiz after this, I promise. But basically, with stress, we produce a lot of cortisol. And what cortisol does after long periods of time, and I'm not talking about 2 years of COVID, I'm talking about longer periods of time, but we do worry about it in vulnerable populations, that it does shrink the brain. There's a loss of synaptic connections between neurons, and there's a thinning of that prefrontal cortex that's involved in impulse control and judgment and planning and execution. So chronic stress with an increase in stress hormones isn't great for the brain. It's also not great for brains that are in the process of development. Sadly, as I've talked about COVID personally, like my life was kind of like a flat line. I'm not bored by my life, but my brain is kind of going along like this. Adolescent brains, and I wish I was standing in front of you because I could have been more dramatic with my hand gestures, so they're hopefully not leading to more feedback. But their brains are going like this. And so they're missing out on a lot of experiences, and the stress is having an impact. Again, I don't want to be Debbie Downer, and I don't want to leave you with this sense that all of your children are having a loss of their prefrontal cortices and all of that. I'm just giving you some biological background to have a sense of what's going on with your kids. They don't need to be, you don't need to call your neurologist and rush out for an MRI tomorrow. It's just to sort of give you a sense of what kind of impact and how we need to think about it and how we need to plan for our kids. So who wants to be a teenager anyway? It's pretty tough to be a teenager, right? While some of the things are great, they're also very much related to their friends. They're, social creatures. They're becoming independent from us. They're, highly motivated to do things that aren't necessarily the best things for them. And even though we have all the knowledge in the world that we can impart to them, how often do our teenagers come to us and say, can you give me advice? It's an artful dance, and we'll get there later about how to give them that advice. So what are they feeling? They're feeling lots of things. And their feelings are often out of control. And again, this is normal, basic teenage development. Their feelings are coming online, and they're feeling them big time. A big question for psychiatrists like me is my child depressed, or are they just acting like a teenager? Is my child bipolar, or are they just acting like a teenager? Well, fortunately, most of the time, they're acting like a teenager. They're supposed to have big emotions. This is when they practice those things. I look at adolescence as a rehearsal for adulthood, where they learn how to have big feelings. The stakes are lower. They might flunk a math test, but they might not lose a job. And so they're supposed to have these big feelings. They're supposed to get into trouble with them, and they're supposed to figure out, what do I do with them the next time? How do I regulate my emotions? How do I develop coping skills? How do I learn to interact with others in ways that are more productive and not destructive? So what are the kinds of stress factors that our teenagers are experiencing? So you could tell me more than I can tell you, but social media, Snapchat, Instagram, all of those things, and that have some upsides, but also have a pretty negative impact. And I think we all read those reports that Facebook knew that a majority of teenage girls feel worse about themselves when they spend time on things like Instagram and TikTok. They know this. We know this. We didn't have to hear that report. Anyone who has a teenager knows that it's not all positive. That the risk of social media is it leads to what we call downer comparisons, right? Downer comparisons. That rarely do people feel better when they look at all these images coming at them of these carefully curated lives. So teenagers are affected by social media. FOMO, they're afraid of missing out. Peer pressure, they're afraid of doing the right thing, looking the right way, acting the right way. That's nothing new, but it's something that is affecting our teens as a constant stress. They're affected by us and the pressures we put on them. So they have pressures from their social world, they have pressures from us, and the pressures that we put on them in high-performing school districts and high-performing zip codes, and that's also a concern. And the pressures that we need to think about our role in the pressures that we're putting on our children. College pressure. I'm sure no one's feeling any college pressure here, and that's also something that we need to be more realistic about and more thoughtful about. So many teenagers now are suffering from this sense of, and it's not their fault, but a kid yesterday said to me in my office, like, I really want to go to Harvard, but they have a 4% acceptance rate. 4% acceptance rate. And the idea that only Harvard would be good enough. The fact that teenagers, did we know what acceptance rates these schools had when we were in high school? That's the tip of the iceberg. That's a whole other conversation, but that's a significant stress on our teenagers. Things in the world, racial injustice and racial protests that have been going on, climate change. There's so many things in the world that they're worried about and thinking about. Back to that brain slide from earlier in my talk, the adolescent brain is now able, because of that prefrontal cortex, to think abstractly. When you start to think abstractly, you start to be able to do many more things, but the flip side is you get to worry about more things. So rates of anxiety go up in adolescence. Why? Because they can start to think about the planet, my effect on the planet, forest fires in California, like the melting polar ice caps. Those are things that 10-year-olds might think about, but 15 to 18-year-olds can feel those things deeply. They can connect those abstract feelings to deep feelings. All of these slides that I just kind of raced through, kind of all the things, not only can they think about these things, but they feel them deeply. So they're connecting the thought and the feeling, and things, don't feel so good inside. So then we get to COVID. So here we are with the novel coronavirus that has upended our lives over the last several years. What are the unique impacts of COVID? I would say isolation, isolation, isolation are the three main features of COVID that have had a direct and enduring impact. And we could spend a half hour just on isolation. Teenagers, like all people, need others around them. Teenagers even more. When you think about walking down a hallway, I'm actually sometimes a little worried when I walk down the hallway at WHS or any high school, like, and you're like, oh my God, I'm going to get, attacked. They're all over each other, right? And it's great that they're supposed to be all over each other. They're hugging, they're holding hands, they've got their arms, they might be punching each other, or, remember back in high school, like there's so much physical contact, there's so much facial contact, and all that is necessary. That's the reason why I went through the brain slides, to know that all of that needs input from their world. All of those things about development needs input from their world, and that isolation, all they had was us to look at, for all that time in isolation and all that time at home, and a screen. I can't stand talking to you on the screen. I'm just looking at myself. Like, I don't want to look at myself. I'm looking at your faces. So isolation had a big impact. And then wearing masks, really rough, really rough. I know everyone's going to be worried about what happens, the next step. And I know I'm not going to tackle that one. I know that's a different issue. But I'm looking forward to seeing people's faces. I'll share a story that I've shared with some of the people that I've worked with in Weston. It really came to me. I have a sixth grader that I'm seeing in my office who was in the office with her mom, and she was complaining about the assistant sixth grade teacher that she had. And that sixth grade teacher, she kept saying, was getting too close to her. She really likes to have her physical boundaries. And she said that, and I think she was like snarling at the assistant and being rude to the assistant, and word had come back from the teacher to the mother to our session. And while we're sitting there talking about what to do, the mother said to her, well, why don't you just look up at Miss So-and-so and say, could you please, smile at her and ask her for some space. And then the sixth grader turns to her mother and says, I can't smile at her. I'm wearing a mask. And I have been stuck with that story. It's been running in my head the last 2 weeks, and I realized, of course, no one's smiling at anybody. No one can use a smile. So this poor girl is being very, snarky with her assistant teacher because that's the only tool she has right now. Obviously, she can use the words, but we don't have the facial expression to go with the words to make a difference. The other thing about masks, we can talk about masks for another half an hour, but we need to see people's faces in order to process that information. And I would say that teenagers need it even more than we do. And so without having that input, they're learning how to read faces. Teenagers often mistaken, teenagers are more likely. There's a whole literature on perception and misperception of emotions. And many teenagers will misread fear and anger for distress. They often, when psychologists do these kinds of, conduct these kinds of studies and show facial expressions, adults are much better than teenagers at accurately reading facial expressions. The way they get better is by seeing faces, and their brains develop the capacity to read facial expressions. The kinds of students that I often work with have trouble with that to begin with. Imagine having to learn that with people being masked. Sadness and loss. We've all experienced sadness and loss. There have been financial insecurity, food insecurity. We've lost, weddings, funerals, bar mitzvahs, graduations, proms. We've lost family members who died because of COVID, or grandparents that we haven't been able to see. The toll has really been remarkable. And the fear factor of, will I get COVID? And every family has had a different reaction and response to COVID, which has also made it very complicated. Some more conservative, some less conservative. There's this whole thing about COVID shaming. And our adolescents, some have been much more scared by this. I'm going to skip through this slide because I've sort of been discussing it. And there's a lot of stress on our children, that affects them. I hear about this being that perfect Western kid, and so on. I'll let you read these because I want to make sure we have time to talk, and I don't have too many more slides to go through. So here's what maybe you came to this talk to want to know about. How do I know if my child is in trouble? When do I worry? That's a frequent question that I get. So I'm going to run through these slides. I'm going to, this talk will be available online, so you don't have to, those of you who are writing things down, you don't have to write down. I can make my slides available. Things like being forgetful, not being able to concentrate, decreased motivation. There's a long list: moodiness, being short-tempered, being overwhelmed, less enjoyment in things you normally enjoy. You often wonder, if you're the only one. These are the kinds of things if you find your child talking about: change in temperament, change in sleep, change in appetite. Kids having more stomach aches and headaches. Particularly younger children often express their stress in their body before they have the words to express themselves. Stress can come out in multiple ways. And how does it impact? We're often seeing this a lot in our teenagers, especially blaming themselves for things. Negative self-talk, like I'm no good, I'm bad. And their self-esteem has really taken a hit during COVID. So here's the sidebar that I talked about. What's the first aid that you could offer to your children? And I also want to say that doing these things, because what's our goal here? As I said at the beginning, the goal for adolescents is to become independent and resilient. And it's important to think about how do we make our children resilient? How do we make them advocate for themselves? How do we get them to feel good about themselves? And one of the best lessons I think we can learn through COVID is how can we remain resilient in the face of adversity? Now, for some, it's really hard and impossible, and some kids are doing really poorly, and I don't want parents to feel badly if their kid is suffering and they're not resilient, but it's a goal we want to set. So how do we handle our children? And this applies in COVID and non-COVID situations. The top three things in terms of my advice is to listen to them. Teenagers want to be heard. They don't want to be lectured at. Now, I'm very guilty of lecturing, especially my son, who's 22, and is what we call on a need-to-know basis. Those of you may have children who come home and tell you everything, and then on the need-to-know, and you try and catch them on the slide. And he doesn't want my advice, yet I'm an advice factor. So I have to, just like tonight, I have to fold my hands and put them in my lap and just listen. They want you to acknowledge their feelings. Even if you disagree with them, it's okay to say, that sucks. It goes a long way, and you may not say that to your younger children based on the language you use at home. So you can pick your word, fill in the blank. But if you listen to them and just validate and normalize their feeling, even if it's not the feeling you think they should have, they will feel more connected to you. They will feel that you understand them, and it will help them tell you things that they really want to say. You want to help them identify where these feelings are coming from, and you don't take what they say at face value. Like, I'm going to fail that math test. I'm just going to fail that math test. Like, I'm failing all my classes. Realize that their temperature has gotten pretty high, and you want to help them just bring the temperature down. So again, you want to go easy, help them problem solve, but let them lead the charge with problem solving. Things like I'm just giving you throwing a lot of things at you here. But just some of these things I think are important to think about, and maybe could become a topic for another talk. You want to help them take perspective. You want to focus on strengths. You might want to say to them, what would your friends tell you to do in this situation? That's another piece of advice. But probably more important than all of that is to think about these things: sleep, approach to food, meditation, exercise activity, and having fun. And these things apply to you too, not just your teenagers. So teenager first aid, very important to think all of these basic things, I can't emphasize enough. And then I really want to end with your stress management, because if we're not healthy, how are we going to help our kids? How do we help them go through COVID? Now, what's really been difficult about the pandemic is often, and in the past, our teenagers would be going through very different things than we're going through. Like they're going through breakups and teachers they don't like, or not getting on the football team, or not getting to the college they want, or someone looking at them funny in the hallway, or whatever it might be. They got fired from their job. And we can help them because we have distance. What's unique about COVID is that we're going through the same thing at the same time. However, I think it's important to take a deep breath, think about our food, our nutrition, our sleep, how we're managing things, getting off social media. Someone recently told me about this new thing where in the morning, don't check your phone for the first 10 or 15 minutes. That sounded good to me. I stole that piece of advice. I can't say I'm living up to it this week, but it's a good piece of advice. And we just really remember that we have to figure these things out for ourselves. I'm just gonna allow time. I see we're almost at the 40-minute mark here. I want to give time. You can sort of read these as I'm speeding through them at the end. Your first aid is their first aid. Remember, self-care is essential. I can't emphasize this slide enough. And what were our silver linings? So again, I don't want to end on a downer, so I'm not. We've learned a lot of lessons, and I want us each to think when we're feeling really low about the pandemic is what were the good things that came out of this? Hopefully the answer isn't nothing, but I think all of us can find that healthy place. My place is hiking, so I'll end with this cairn that's directing to a better place, which I know we can all get to, and our kids can get to too. So I want to leave on this note, end on this sort of optimism, and then I hope I haven't talked too quickly and the feedback got better. I've enjoyed sharing my thoughts with you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much. So at this point, I'm going to stop the recording.